Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, Editor-in-Chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Before we start, a quick note. We're hosting a Q&A podcast next week, and we want to hear from you. Send questions about Turkey or anything else to info@turkeyrecap.com. You can also submit questions through a link in our show notes. We read all our messages and look forward to answering your questions in our upcoming one-year anniversary show for Recap Radio. That said, the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran continues with global implications, especially in energy markets. This pressure has restarted talks between Erbil and Baghdad to export oil through Turkey to circumvent risks on the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, the war is testing years of rapprochement efforts between Turkey and Iraq, which were aligning more on trade and security interests prior to the conflict. Most prominently, the outbreak of violence threatens Ankara's peace process with the PKK, or Kurdistan Workers' Party, whose militants are largely based in areas governed by the KRG, or Kurdistan Regional Government, in northern Iraq. To talk about all that and more, my guest today is Lahib Higel, Interim Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa Program at the International Crisis Group. As always, the situation is fluid, so please note this talk was recorded at 2 p.m. Turkey time on Monday, March 16th. Let's get into it. Thanks for joining us, Lahib.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, to set the scene, I don't focus on Iraq. Most of the time I focus on Turkey. Can you just lay out what's happening in Iraq and how it's been impacted since the Iran war started, what's been going on today?
Of course. So, interestingly, Iraq has not been much in the news, I think, because there's so much that has been going on elsewhere in the region, of course. But in fact, since all these escalatory cycles started after 7 October, Iraq has probably witnessed its most unstable and intense period since the U.S.-Israel strikes on Iraq began on the 28th of February. So from day one, or about 24 hours in, the so-called Iraqi resistance groups started escalating against U.S. bases inside Iraq, which they've done in the past. So nothing new about that. However, it's the intensity of these attacks and how they've escalated over the last 2 weeks, which is quite extraordinary. So,
and these are Shia, sorry to interrupt, right?
Right. So these are Shia militia groups, of which some are part of Iran's so-called axis of resistance, this transnational network. Many of them are embedded in the Iraqi state security forces as a part of the popular mobilization forces, but several of them really respond to Iran more than they do to the Iraqi state. And Iraq has had, of course, a challenge containing them in the past. And I think right now they're at a place where they're unable to contain them at all. And a part of the reason for that is that in the past, both Iran and the U.S. That have allies in Iraq have had an interest in keeping Iraq somewhat stable in what's been going on elsewhere in the region. This time around for Iran, this is a fight for survival. And likewise, it is for these groups in Iraq who rely on Iran. So for them, escalation makes sense both in defense of Iran, but also for their own political survival in Iraq. At least they think so. And so in the last 2 weeks, we haven't only seen attacks on U.S. military bases in Baghdad, Erbil. We've also seen these groups partake in attacks against Iranian Kurdish opposition groups that are based in the Kurdistan region. They've expanded to attack diplomatic missions, not only the U.S., but also the Emirati consulate in Erbil, for instance. They have attacked energy infrastructure in the Kurdistan region that they've also done in the past. But in addition, they've also targeted oil fields in Basra and international oil companies that operate there. This is quite new. And then lastly, they have also attacked several neighboring Gulf Arab states.
And this is in addition to the drone strikes from Iran.
This is in addition to the drone strikes from Iran and attacks also from the U.S. and Israel against these groups inside Iraq. So Iraq is caught in the crosshairs. It is being fired upon from both parties to the conflict. And at the same time, there is instability that is generated by these domestic Iraqi groups that are aligned.
Yeah, quite a mess. And we'll be following your work to keep track of what's going on. I always appreciate it. Since this war began, obviously, we've all heard the discussions about the US and Israeli governments considering Kurdish groups as possible ground forces to do some kind of offensive inside Iran. US President Trump later walked back those statements and seemed to do a U-turn, saying he doesn't want to complicate the war further. What's the latest on these Kurdish militias, and what's your view on the likelihood of such an operation taking shape at all?
Right. So about a week ago, there was a lot of talk about this, of course, and I don't think that there is a doubt that there has been communication between the Americans and some of these Kurdish groups. We saw a call, for instance, between Trump, not only with the Iraqi Kurdish parties, but also with the leader of the Iranian KDPI, Mustafa Hijri. However, I think it was revealed quite quickly that these ideas are very premature. Yes, Israel has been striking IRGC and besieged positions in the Kurdish provinces in Iran. However, that does not suffice at all for the Kurdish groups to rise, whether those that are inside the country or for those that are in Iraq to move over the border into Iran. And mind you, the groups that are in Iraq, most of them, have been displaced for decades. They have not been actively fighting like some of the other Kurdish groups that we have in the region for a very long time. We're talking about 2,000 to 3,000 people. That is not a lot. You know, and then on top of that, you would need to arm them in the way that they can sustain a fight inside these areas. And they would probably need protection from the air, which is also not clear that the Americans would provide. And I think the rationale from the side of these groups themselves is that maybe, we would get into this if there is an opportunity. That opportunity will only present itself if the regime is significantly weakened. We haven't seen that the regime is significantly weakened internally. Any uprising would probably be met with severe repression. And so I think the whole idea that that was going to be possible within a few weeks into this war was just unrealistic.
Mhm. And there hasn't been any signaling from any leaders in the Kurdish regions, from KRG, from Talibanis, saying that this was a good idea, from what I understand. Have you seen anything?
I mean, to the contrary, I think once the reports came out about these calls, making assumptions on behalf of the Kurdish groups, on behalf of the Iraqi Kurdish parties, they were very quickly out to say, we want nothing to do with this. We want to stay neutral in this war, and we will not allow any movement across the border. That goes both for the KDP and for the PUK. And keep in mind that the Kurdistan region of Iraq is the most advanced, so to speak, of the Kurdish regions across these four countries. They have been very successful in terms of the level of autonomy that they have developed, their economic prosperity, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that they are ready to jeopardize that. And certainly not to jeopardize the fate of other Kurdish brethren that they see would probably come into this fight more as cannon fodder than anything else. And I think that is a realization that many of the Kurdish groups across the region have come to, especially after how things went down in neighboring Syria just a few months ago for the SDF. So there are several factors that are playing in here. But at the end of the day, the Iraqi Kurdish parties will be looking after the interests of the Iraqi Kurdistan region. And they both have relations with Tehran. The PUK is obviously the closest. Uh, Unless the regime is on its way out, you don't jeopardize those relationships being right at the border.
Mhm. Yeah, and I should counter my previous statement by saying that some militia leaders said that they would be willing to fight on the condition that there was some kind of air cover or U.S. ground offensive. And I don't know how representative their statements were because maybe it's one guy talking. I have no idea, right? To move on, though, you did a very comprehensive report on Turkey-Iraq rapprochement, basically citing how anti-terror operations and water resources and regional trade were driving Turkey and Iraq closer together. Cooperation was happening. Now we've got the Iran war. So broadly speaking, how is that dynamic changing since the report, which I'll link to in the show notes, since that report came out? Do you see any directional changes in Turkey-Iraq relations in the short term?
Look, I think everyone is overtaken by the events in the region right now. I don't think that either Turkey or Iraq have much bandwidth to think about how to proceed on these bilateral files. But I think that the war will have serious repercussions for not just for this relationship, but just about every relationship that Iraq has with its neighboring countries. And I think one of them is actually on the negative side, in the sense that the outlook right now is, of course, that the regime in Iran will survive this war. That will embolden the regime's partners in Iraq that have always been skeptical about this rapprochement. And I think that they will be even more vocal about it going forward. If you look at, their rhetoric in terms of what's been going on in the region for the last 2 years, it's been very much a rhetoric of, a larger conspiracy, right? What happened in Syria is benefiting Turkey. Turkey is stepping into the space of Iran in the region, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so if you're aligned with Iran, of course, this is seen as a threat. And they don't want to allow what has happened in Syria supposedly to happen in Iraq. Now, that prospect is, of course, unrealistic. There is no, such equation that would allow for that anyway. But that type of paranoia in the minds of these sort of more extreme Shia militia groups, but also some of the political parties is very much there. Now, of course, it also depends on, we don't have a government at the moment. In Iraq, it's a caretaker government since the elections in November. And I think that the war is now going to delay government formation even more. The current caretaker Prime Minister Soudani, was, of course, one of the personalities that was instrumental in the rapprochement with Turkey. We don't know if he's going to be able to continue. We also don't know if the so-called pro-Iran side in this equation is going to have the upper hand in the next government. So I think that on some of these files, there is going to be a slight setback. I don't think it's permanent, however. At the end of the day, it is in the interest of Iraq to have improved relations with Turkey for the long run. And we can see that in these infrastructure plans, for instance, with the development road, when it comes to Iraq's most acute priority in its relation with Turkey, which is water. And then, of course, now, because of the war, we see the consequences for the energy markets. Iraq is no longer able to export its oil through the south and through the Strait of Hormuz. And so the pipeline with Turkey is becoming even more important. So, on all of these accounts, it is of Iraq's interest to have a working relationship with Turkey. But I think that there will be some bumps in the road. I don't think that, some of these working committees might be as efficient as they have been in the past for a while in the aftermath of this war. But in the long term, I think that they will come back to many of these things simply because Iraq doesn't have much of another choice.
Yeah, and to loop back on that pipeline, the Ceyhan pipeline from Kirkuk to Ceyhan port in Turkey, that was a source of a lot of problems between Baghdad and Ankara, recently resolved after different court procedures. Is it possible that it reopens without the political baggage? I mean, it does seem like that was a point of contention for Baghdad for a long time. How do you see that pipeline reopening in this crisis emergency situation that we live in right now?
That's right. There's a long history to why that pipeline hasn't been operational for years before this war. Obviously, I think right now there is probably a possibility to export through the pipeline if Baghdad and Erbil can resolve their issues. I don't necessarily think that the main issue is with Ankara right now, but the bigger picture of this is, you referred to the previous court cases, was that Baghdad was upset with Turkey for allowing the Kurdistan region to export oil independently of Baghdad, and this was going on for about a decade. And so there have been these lingering litigation cases that were resolved just now a couple of years ago, which seemed to benefit Iraq. Effectively, we know that Turkey has the leverage. So even if the fallout of these court cases were that Turkey is supposed to pay reparations to Iraq for this, the pipeline runs through Turkey. Turkey can essentially decide what oil it wants to send through there. And we know that with the expiration date for the treaty that governs this pipeline between Iraq and Turkey, the Iraqis would need to convince the Turks that, one, they can actually export the amount of oil that they have committed to, which for a very long time they were unable to do. And so I think Iraq has been, at the best of times, at about a third to half of the capacity that the pipeline takes. So it is not inconceivable that Ankara would want to look at other opportunities, at least to share the exports through that pipeline, potentially from a neighboring country, potentially, for domestic transfer of oil within Turkey. None of these details have been resolved from what I can tell so far. So in the longer run, yes, they would need to come to another arrangement. So that is on the sort of Baghdad-Ankara side. And then internally within Iraq, Baghdad needs to come to a sustainable solution with the Kurdistan region that would allow for these exports to continue. Right now, we're in an emergency situation with the Strait of Hormuz closed. So it is possible that the three parties here can come to an agreement because it benefits all. But again, there are domestic issues between Erbil and Baghdad that need to be resolved, and I don't think we have time to go into them here. But yeah, these are the different factors that play into the pipeline politics.
Yeah. And I also wanted to loop back onto the Iran quote that you said, Turkey seems to step into the spaces that Iran vacates, as it did in Syria, but the situation's not the same in Iraq because there is bigger population that is, can I say, sympathetic to Iran or aligned with these militias that you were referencing, the resistance. They're active on the ground. What do you make of the other analyses that often talk about Turkey and Iran competing for influence inside Iraq? Do you view it that way? How do you see this power competition in Iraq between those two countries?
To some degree, it is a competition, but it's also not, because they're not on equal footing in this country. You were alluding to the demographic difference between Iraq and Syria. And of course, that plays a role. About 60% of Iraq is Shia, um, uh, and the others between Sunni Arabs and Kurds. So that the equation for the political establishment in Iraq would quickly change is not really on the table. That doesn't mean that a majority of the Shia population is aligned with Iran. I think we've seen signs of quite the contrary to that over the last few years. Essentially, Turkey will not have the same relationship with Iraq as it does with Syria, simply for these reasons. But also the other one is, of course, since 2003, Iran has penetrated the Iraqi state in a deep way, and it is not only related to the resistance groups. It's a relationship that goes beyond even the Shia political parties. It includes its relationship with Sunni parties, with Kurdish parties, and the Turks cannot really compete with that, I would say. But of course, should Iran become weaker, I think that there is absolutely an opportunity where Turkey's hand will be strengthened in Iraq. But I don't think it will ever be fully at the expense of the Iranians in Iraq, simply because of the domestic makeup of Iraq. So yeah, from the point of view of many of these groups inside Iraq, I think that they are drumming up a risk that isn't really there.
Is it accurate to say that Turkey and Iran are working with different populations inside Iraq? Like there's no crossover. These aren't swing voters, if I can put it that way.
I mean, look, I think that one of the reasons that Turkey has been more successful in its policy towards Iraq in the last few years, that has actually generated this rapprochement, is because they have abandoned the idea that we should only be working with certain representatives of the Iraqi population. In the first decade after the U.S. invasion, that was mainly the Sunni Arabs and the opposition. To some degree, the KDP, mainly the Kurdish party, and then Turkmen parties. Now there's been a realization that this is the reality of Iraq. Governance in Iraq is going to be Shia dominated for the foreseeable future. We need to have, if not equally good relations, then much improved relations with those political representatives as well. And I think it has served both to do that. I mean, obviously, a lot of the setback was much due to the tensions between Baghdad and Ankara during the Maliki years. It's taken a lot to recover from that, but I think that they are on a good way, at least when we're speaking about the more sort of moderate parties within the Shia establishment. You will have some of the fringes that are probably never going to be swung in a different direction.
Thank you for breaking that down. I just wanted to get into the nuance of those before getting into this very nuanced question about the PKK peace process in Turkey, which I'm wondering how much of it are you following, and have you seen any signs that there was movement before the war in Iran for members of the KRG to oversee some kind of disarmament process? Because under the peace process here in Turkey, the soldiers, the militias linked to PKK are supposed to hand over their weapons to somebody, and that somebody was going to be the KRG official in some capacity. Did you see any preparation for this before the war? And how do you see this process playing out now that we do have a war?
Right. So maybe I'll start with your last question. Of course, this is going to be very much on pause while this war is going on. But in terms of indications before the war, I mean, the Kurdish parties have been, the Iraqi Kurdish parties have been very much willing to support this process. And I think once both the PKK and Turkey are ready to make their tangible steps towards each other, whether it's inside Iraq or inside Turkey, they will be there to facilitate. The only gesture that we've seen happening in Iraq was the symbolic ceremony where some PKK members threw their weapons into a fire in Sulaymaniyah last year. That's about the disarmament that we've seen to date. And I think that there are some factors that have delayed the process. One of them is developments in Syria, and that the Syria file got entangled with sort of the PKK peace process as it related to, providing Kurdish rights inside Turkey in exchange for the PKK to disarm in Iraq and in other places. And again, now this also applies to Turkish citizens, PKK members that are located in Syria. And so the development in terms of resolving the conundrum of the Northeast, where the SDF has been holding power, and finding a solution with Damascus, I think has, contributed to the overall delay in this process. But and let's see, where we all stand after this war. But I think that the idea on all sides, and certainly in the Syrian theater, is that the agreement that they have come to so far between the SDF and Damascus is going to be implemented. And Turkey, as we know, has very good insight into how that is going. And I can imagine that will have a positive ripple effect on the PKK process. What the one caveat here is, of course, the Iranian dimension now. So if we come back to the scenario that we talked about a little while ago, where the Iranian regime is weakened to the degree that you start seeing a Kurdish uprising in Iran, then that could activate groups that are very much a problem for Turkey, including PJAK, which essentially is the Iranian equivalent of the PKK. So, and we don't know what would the PKK position be on this if that occurs? What would Öcalan's position be on that? So, I mean, this is still a scenario that is not in the making. Maybe the PKK process will be, playing its course before that even materializes as an option. But as we've seen with these processes in the past, they're not resolved in a year or two. They take much longer, and we can only imagine that the disarmament of the PKK, whether we're talking about elements in Syria or Iraq, is probably several years down the line. How is the Iranian regime going to fare during that period? What's going to happen in Iranian Kurdish areas? This is anyone's guess, really.
To wrap, that was Lahib Higel, Interim Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa Program at the International Crisis Group. This podcast is a production of Turkey Recap, a newsletter on Turkish politics, foreign policy, and business. If you like what you heard, visit turkeyrecap.com for more coverage. We like to hear from listeners. Send feedback, suggestions, and questions about all things Turkey to info@turkeyrecap.com. We also invite Turkish language listeners to visit our Turkish language platform, studiorecap.com, where you can get daily newsletters and podcasts on Turkish politics from right here in Ankara. Stay safe, stay well, and see you next time.